Hi there, everyone. My name is Chris Trujillo. I teach here at the University of Chicago, and I want to welcome you to this event hosted by the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, Grief and Grievance in the Pandemic. Before we get started, I just want to begin by thanking a few bodies, of course, the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, and especially Tate Process, who's been so instrumental in taking care of so many of the practical aspects of this event. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for the event as well, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and also the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory. I also would like to point your attention to two other events that are hosted and co-hosted by the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. Today at 5 o'clock, there will be an event titled Academic Labor in Crisis Time with Jennifer Doyle and Nick Mitchell. There is also going to be an event on Thursday, May 27th at 5 p.m., which is a book salon on the book titled Love in the Drug War, Selling Sex and Finding Jesus on the Mexico-US Border with author Sarah Luna. And so Tate will paste the links for these events in the chat so that you all have information about those in case you're interested. Today, we're going to be hearing from four esteemed speakers. First, Joshua Chambers-Letson, who is professor of performance studies at Northwestern University. We will then hear from Gina Kim, who is professor of intercultural communication, cultural studies, and critical race studies at Cal State University Northridge. Third, we will hear from Dina Luciano, who is associate professor of English at Rutgers University. And then finally, David Rahman, who's professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at USC. Now, a few things that I wanted to note to everyone in terms of just the program and also norms for communication. I'll just open up a little bit with some thoughts and then hand the platform over to our speakers, who will present for around 5 or 7 minutes. We'll then sort of open dialogue amongst the speakers, but we of course also want to get you engaged as well. So we've left both the chat open and also the Q&A. So if there are less sort of formal comments that you'd like to make throughout any of the talks, any of the conversations or the presentations, please feel free to drop those in the chat. If you have a specific question that you would love to be taken up by our speakers, then please leave that in the Q&A, and then I will do my best to moderate those questions as well. So with that, I just wanted to begin first by recognizing how difficult a year this past year has been. And I wanted to say a little bit about where the motivation for this event came. And I have to be honest, because in order to do that, I have to sort of claim my identity as a Grey's Anatomy stan. I think that one of the things that I've found, especially as someone who lives alone, is that the difficulty of mourning for me has been the difficulty of collective mourning. And what that has meant is that so much of the affective life that I have lived over the past year has been one that has been mediated by so many different forms of media. And for me, that means lots of screen media, right? So TikTok, Twitter, Zoom, of course, but also television. And I sort of wanted to talk a little bit about the ways in which I'm curious how certain norms of performing and practicing grief have been taught to us by certain media formats. And I have this idea about the ways in which Grey's Anatomy, which is obviously the longest running medical drama, has done such an interesting job at teaching a certain form of mourning, one that makes us think that by minute 37, in that climactic moment, we will shed all of our tears and have this cathartic moment and then be done. But I also am really curious about the limitations of these lessons of grieving and what we can't do, even though these sort of media formats are attempting to give us something. I also think about this in relationship to a perhaps more popular or recognizable piece of television, at least over the past year, and this is WandaVision. So I wanted to actually just sort of share a couple of screenshots because, and I'm sure most of you know exactly what I'm going to share at the moment, but one thing that I was so fascinated by over the course of The pandemic is the proliferation of cultural objects that are dealing explicitly with the question of grief. And so here, I just wanted to share the sort of, climactic moment, the sort of emblematic moment that we get in Wanda Vision, where Vision says to Wanda, "But what is grief if not love persevering?" And then the fascinating thing about this sort of moment is the ambiguity and ambivalence of response to it, right? On the one hand, we have folks who are saying that this is one of the best pieces of screenwriting that they've seen for years. And then others are like, well, this is so crazy cheesy, right? And the cheesiness is something that has actually led to the memification, right, of this particular scene, such that we get memes like this one, which says, "But what is apple bottom jeans if not with the boots with the fur," right? Or, citing Gaga, "But what is love if not stupid?" And I thought to myself a little bit about what was going on with this particular piece of television and wondered about the ways in which both we might want to read it as catharsis on the one hand, but also cheesiness on the other. And it came to me to think about this as well through the sort of framework of camp, right? The ways in which it offers a kind of admixture of seriousness with the sort of campiness of televisual drama, but the ways in which it also brings out the artificiality of this emotional moment and its intended effect on its audience. And so again, it brought me to think a little bit more about the ways in which televisual intention enables a kind of pedagogy of grieving, right? A pedagogy of mourning. So once again, I'm thinking, what exactly are the practices that we have cultivated over this past year in order to grieve the atrocious amount of loss that we have all experienced? This is also in many ways informed by questions about the different genealogies of learned grief as well. And in large part, I'm also curious about the ways in which we might think about the politics of grief that emerged during the AIDS pandemic and its sort of impact on the politics of Doug Maui Wushet, the sort of loss of Black life because of police assault, the emergence, or rather the sort of focus on anti-Asian violence, the ever-increasing class disparities, right, amidst debates about what counts as essential work, and even now at this moment, the atrocity of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And so I think that I want to attend to the intersection of all of these losses as we move forward with our conversation. So with that, I just want to stop and to hand it over to our speakers. So we'll go in here, and I will hand over the platform to Josh first.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Chris, and thank you with you, with Dana, with David, and with Jenna, who are people that I admire, learn a lot from, and adore. And Jenna and I were just texting each other about how nice it is to be the grief ladies of the Academy. Chris asked us to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes. I'm going to present some of the opening passages for an essay that I've been working on for a forthcoming catalog for the Whitney Biennial, where I've been sort of thinking about the question of grief and the aesthetic. So it can just set up some questions about sort of what is the aesthetic, what is the role of the aesthetic in mediating grief and work. Alzheimer's slowly and painfully stripped him away from my family. Still, his death was the throbbing missing that flooded the space the moment breath left him for the last time, the dropping sensation and the world falling out of sync, the reaching out repeatedly for someone who isn't there, and then the dull awareness that a part, that a center, that the whole of one's world that the world is achingly and acutely broken. The dawning sensation that life will now be lived in a durational expanse known only as after. Grief is an unbearable kind of shattering that must nonetheless be borne by the left behind. Although he lived to 89, his death still felt like the death of another Black person gone too soon. Though it was not caused by COVID, his passing accumulated with and compounded within the storm of Black and brown death raging as a result of the pandemic. The night that he died, he came to my grandmother, Tatsuko, in a dream. They had been married for 67 years, and she told us that in that dream, she asked him to take her with her. And the next night, he responded as she had a heart attack. She too began to slip away from us over the next 2 months. The pandemic raged on. We said our goodbyes on screens. We watched their funerals on phones. After the vaccine, I took my first trip in a year to lay stones at their graves. On the drive to the cemetery, my aunt and I listened to the verdict in Derek Chauvin's trial for the murder of George Floyd. Later, I pick up the last of my grandparents' things, pouring through photos of their lives together. Looking at snapshots of other times and places, I think of Floyd's death and of Brianna, Sandra, Rekia, Trayvon, and more. And I think to myself that their long lives, dying at 89 and 90 at the peak of a pandemic that still somehow did not touch them, were a triumph against the best efforts of these United States. He narrowly escaped lynching with his brother as a teenager, and she was Hibakusha, a survivor of the atomic bomb that US forces dropped on the predominantly civilian population of Hiroshima, Japan. America may be an ideal, and that's America in scare quotes, but it is also a colonial horror and a storm of racial terror. It is an occupation, a legal and social compact built to maintain the institutions and effects of white rule, racial hierarchy, and settler colonialism. America is forged from erased histories of objectification and exclusion, accumulation and dispossession, incarceration and internment, and the churning of the imperial war machine. It is death, compounding with death, making more death. All of these elements were part of America when my grandparents were born nearly 100 years ago, and all were present when they died. Not better, not worse, just variations in degree, scale, and timing. But still, in the cracks and corners of this history that won't stop hurting, there are histories that weren't supposed to happen. The long and loving lives my grandparents lived together, the moments archived in their photographs, the hours of care and relief, the laughter and crying, absence and holding, immigrancy, Blackness, being and becoming. Christina Sharp has influentially and elegantly written that Black life is lived in the wake of slavery, in churning seas that affect the drowning, destruction, and devaluation of Black being in the diaspora. Poring through the photos of my grandparents' lives, I was also left to ask, after Sharp, and this is Sharp, what does it look like, entail, and mean to attend to, care for, comfort, and defend those already dead, those dying, and those living lives consigned to the possibility of always imminent death, life lived in the presence of death, to live this imminence and imminence as and in the wake. And that's the end of the quotation. By raising Sharp's question, which regards Black life specifically, in relation to the interracial intimacies of my grandparents, I don't mean to imply that US American Blackness and diasporic Japaneseness, or that Black and Asian experiences of death and dying in and because of America are fully commensurate and interchangeable. The differentiated histories of racialization and colonization, including Japan's own violent history of colonial and imperial violence, including my grandfather's own role as part of the occupying and war forces in Vietnam and Korea, make such a slippage impossible and inadvisable. Nonetheless, these histories do overlap and cohere into what Lisa Lowe describes as the intimacies of four continents, or the less visible forms of alliance, affinity, and society amongst variously colonized peoples. If such intimacies are less visible, the realm of the aesthetic practice is a space in which they can be experienced, sensed, felt, and shared out with the world, just as the aesthetic can be a central place for working through the grief that is left in this kind of living's wake. So I'm going to skip just a little bit to one last passage and say that part of what I'm grappling with is what it means to have lost access access to the aesthetic rituals of grief over the last year, not just in the forms of the sort of performed rituals of the funeral, but also quite literally in not being able to gather in spaces of aesthetic commune with and for other people. And this seems particularly important because aesthetic work, by my sense of it, is something that actually allows us to confront and deal with death, right? So two of the things that I gesture to is Roland Barthes' discourse on photography, in which he understands photography itself to be a kind of confrontation with death, and Peggy Phelan's articulation of performance as a withdrawal from presence, as that which allows us to sort of see performance itself as a kind of death. And I'll end by sort of noting that my interest is not actually in the Barthesian or the Phelanian suggestion that the entry into the aesthetic is merely a confrontation with death, but more nearly sort of asking what comes after, right? So assuming that it is true that performance stages an encounter with death or dying, it is also true that the encounter with performance can be a way of keeping the dead alive and with the living. For the late queer theorist Jose Munoz, performance leaves behind queer traces of lived experience, feelings, memories, and other ephemera that can be reanimated to extend a performance's life into a future beyond its seeming end. Performance has the power to preserve, maintain, and weekly resurrect the memory of the dead, making it, for Munoz, a powerful means for sustaining queer of color life in the face of annihilation, just as his own premature death a few years ago is a testament to the need for such strategies of survival. To say all this is to say that performance, and indeed the aesthetic, can function as a means of transmitting knowledge between bodies across time, through generations and past death, transferring and substituting memory in the shaping and remaking of life and death as and in culture. In art and performance, time folds, bends, extends, and rebounds as the present is delivered into the past, or as the future takes hold in the present. This reanimation of the past or materialization of different possible futures happens at the level of the body, by way of interlacing memory and imagination. And as Sandra Ruiz has taught us, performance and art's queer and anti-colonial sense of temporality allows for the reorganization of linear notions of time, straight, white, and colonial time, in order to facilitate the rearrangement and birth of other possibilities beyond and past the finitude of life lived on a linear trajectory towards death, as racialized, colonized, queer, trans, and femme life is sometimes and often lived. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Josh. Jen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Josh. It's such an honor to follow you. And also, Chris, I want to thank you for the invitation, and Tate for coordinating us all. And it's such an honor to be in conversation with Josh, Dana, and David. And I'm speaking from the traditional and unceded territory of the Gabrielno and Tongva people. So I'm so grateful to be a part of this talk, in part because I think it has allowed me to process everything that I have lived through, but really haven't thought about. I see the world through grief and loss, and I do so all the time. And my orientation and scholarship around questions of grief, melancholia, and loss, I've studied it through unresolved and unaddressed military, as well as silent state violence that's connected to the expansion of US military empire over the Asia Pacific. And so I think in particular, my comments will really speak with what Josh has been, noting. And in my work, I've explored how loss structures the conditions of militarized migration, the inheritance of trauma between generations, and the comparative and relational history of violences between racial others. And it's been dispiriting to see that this knowledge is so applicable to the moment that we're living in now. So for me, thinking about grief and melancholia in relationship to the pandemic and the notion of the past pandemic has raised a few acute points, and I'll talk about them here. The problem with grief in the pandemic and overall within the entire history of US white supremacist, settler colonial, imperial nation state is that grief is uneven and disproportionately borne by people of color, stigmatized folk, poor people, and people in the global South. So right now, grief is in the zeitgeist. We're talking about it all the time. And especially in the Biden administration, we're encouraged to grieve on a state level, which I think for many feels like a relief, especially after the ways that Trump denied the crisis and never uttered the names of those who died. But it's also clear that the burden of grieving is unequal. And this is especially true if we recognize that competing notions of grief are at the forefront now. one that is narcissistic and privatized, and others that are invested in political mobilization, alliance, and transformation. Second, I appreciate how, Chris, your prompt asked us to connect this crisis to other unresolved crises, most notably the AIDS crisis, which has encouraged me to think about what victim-centered approaches to the crisis would look like, including profoundly troubling the ways that social distancing is upheld by prohibition and stigmatization that denies the real need of especially vulnerable populations for contact and community. And I think we also need to challenge this dangerous over-reliance on biomedicine as a solution for virus-driven crisis. So, I'm just horrified at the ways in which we in the US have hoarded the vaccine, where people around the world have been denied access to it. And as you point out, Chris, in your opening, both the ongoing and evolved nature of the AIDS crisis challenges the idea of a return to normal. There is no post-pandemic and there is no post-crisis. But I think that we will continue to see a kind of produced pressure to forget that this crisis happened. And we see this right now as nations globally are living in different temporalities of the pandemic, with places like India and Brazil suffering acutely, and nations like Japan and Taiwan, who had weathered the pandemic well, returning to lockdowns and experiencing second and third waves. So I think to go back to our collective knowledge about melancholia and trauma, the post-pandemic temporality is palimpsestic. And in that way, to extrapolate on what Josh has already so beautifully said to us, the temporality of the COVID-19 pandemic is a lot like the temporality of trauma and melancholia, which is unpredictable as pain can rise unbidden, unexpectedly, and won't subside, residing uncomfortably with the present. So what we need to be doing now is to anticipate and learn to recognize and address this crisis as it mutates and festers. And it's also, for me, important to reconceptualize this crisis into a language and history of state and civil violence. So to think about this crisis in terms of violence, which geographically divides spaces into zones of health and unhealth, and authorizes attacks and surveillance against already vulnerable bodies. And then to say more about the first point, about how grief is disproportionately borne by people of color, in the US, Black people, Latinos, Indigenous folks, Asian Americans, and colonized peoples. And I'm in terms of colonized folks, I'm thinking particularly of Pacific Islanders like Marshall Islanders, who are nuclear refugees, have borne the majority of the share of over 500,000 COVID deaths we've suffered in the US. As Joshua mentioned, in the pandemic is unfolding in the midst of great pain due to ongoing police and other state-sanctioned anti-Black violence, as well as the rise in anti-Asian violence, directly connected to the representations of Asians as Kung flu and the China virus. And right now, this unconscionable genocidal violence against the Palestinians, as they're confined to an open-air prison and then bombed from the sky. And it's also really important, again, thinking about the biomedicine as a kind of a weapon, how is the Israeli state refused to vaccinate Palestinians, right? And then delayed the crossing of vaccine across borders. So I've been spared all this pain directly, in the sense that no one in my immediate family has died from COVID, nor been the victim of racist or state violence. And this signals clearly my privilege across multiple vantage points. And so my trauma and grief has encouraged me to think about my position in the pandemic as a witness, a spectator, or a bystander, all of whom occupy a vastly different position in relationship to grief and melancholia from the survivors of direct violence. These three categories, witness, spectator, and bystander, are theorized mainly in relationship to the Holocaust and also to civil societies that have lived with right-wing state military violence. And out of all of these positions, the bystander positionality is the most abject of them, and one that I would argue many of us should identify with. I feel guilty all the time for my failure to do anything, and I don't feel worthy of grieving. We theorize the bystander as one who could act, but fails to do so. More than a witness or a spectator, we measure the bystander's action or passivity against what we believe to be the normal or basic human response to crisis. And here I'm drawing a lot from my friend Lynn Itagaki, who's been writing a lot about the bystander position. And so one of the most painful recent examples of bystander inaction are passerbys who did nothing to stop the beating of a Filipina elder in New York City, and the doorman of the fancy building who closed the door behind her. We've been called upon to take bystander training to improve ourselves. And while I appreciate that the call for bystanding training in particular reveals how Americans are so used to seeing racialized bodies in pain that we don't know how to act, like we're just frozen. But I think it's also important to recognize that inaction, quote, I'm quoting Lynn Itagaki, inaction can trigger social responses and shaming that dehumanize already vulnerable populations. So I was really struck by the witnesses who were at the scene as George Floyd died, and as they were testifying at the Derek Chauvin murder trial, and they described feeling like bystanders. They've internalized a sense of guilt and trauma, and they say that they don't feel worthy of grieving George Floyd because they couldn't stop what happened. So the conditions of social, so I want us to think about this and extrapolate this some more. The conditions of social distancing has made many of us occupy these three positions variously, including empathizing and stepping in to bridge wide gulf to feel the grief always already experienced by those who live closer to death. I think that's happening, but also to occupying this feeling that we are unworthy of grieving. So I hope that the recognition of this differential relationship to grief, thought of in relationship to witness, spectator, and violence, bystander, might give us some insight into how grief is experienced and lived right now and can shape our responses to the post-pandemic. And then I just have one other thing to say, which is that it seemed important to me to acknowledge that any understanding of racial melancholia and the way that it has galvanized social protest, including sustaining it during the pandemic, needs to take into account the impact of the deaths of so many Black people. But in particular, I've been haunted by the death of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, and I have not been able to forget it. He was killed by police officer Darren Wilson. His mother, Leslie McFadden, and his father, Michael Brown Sr., took their case to the 53rd UN Committee Against Torture, and they filed a suit there with the International Human Rights Commission. And one of the most painful and powerful statements from that document revolved around how his body was left unprotected outside for nearly 4 hours. This treatment of his body, grotesquely mutilated by 6 bullets and left bleeding in the street in plain view, traumatized countless neighbors who witnessed either the shooting, its aftermath, or both. This trauma was all the more intense for Michael Brown's family, who came to the scene only to find their young son's remains quickly decomposing on the hot summer street. One local leader noted that this action was a message from the police that we can do this to you any day, anytime, in broad daylight, and there's nothing you can do about it. And a local resident shared her belief that these efforts were done to set an example, and that they shot a Black man and they left his body in the street to let you know this could be you. And during the days following his death, protesters would recall this violation, as well as Eric Garner's death by a chokehold and his last words, "I can't breathe." So there's a lot that I think about right now. Families of police violence are prohibited from being with their dead for hours and sometimes days, while the state takes control over their body. Brown's family highlight that the inability for the family to console the dead body, to be with it, to touch it, while it's still warm as life leaves it, is a cruelty and is torture. It's impossible for me not to think about the pain they feel in seeing their son and yet not being able to be with him. As we dwell in knowledge of families in pain, watching through window doors or clear plastic sheets as their loved ones die of COVID on hospital beds and unable to hold them. I'm not trying to say that it's the same violence or the experience of the grief is the same for the survivors, except that following this thread for me animates a persistent undercurrent of anti-Blackness that's shared across poor healthcare, exposure to state violence, heightened surveillance, and state negligence that we need to be encouraged to remain attached to, articulate, and animate. And to Josh's point, I especially see this as necessary because of the breakdown of social rituals and the absence of signs, especially around mourning and burials, due to the need for socially distancing to prevent the spread of disease. Even as nationally, we're encouraged to collectively grieve and mourn as a matter of social and civic well-being. And so while the humanization of people suffering from and dying from COVID is rare, and as far as I know, there are no local or national movements for mourning directed by the survivors or family members who died from COVID, what's stepping in is the celebration of first responders and also a kind of celebration of our collective resiliency. And I've seen this in my community in Los Angeles. I teach at CSUN, a state institution, which is predominantly Latino. And I've heard from dozens of students and colleagues as they are traumatized and deal with COVID deaths in their family. But my institution never acknowledges these deaths. And instead, they consistently and fucking all the time praise us for our resilience. We have just stepped up to the pandemic, and they're just so proud of us. And so I think that, the main thing I want to say is that we need to continue to insist that the white supremacist violence we're living through is not just happening next to or adjacent to the pandemic, but there are twin processes. And I hope that this insistence may disrupt the neoliberal and narcissistic grief that's oriented toward closure, forgiveness, and forgetting, and continue to feed an insurgent melancholia toward political mobilization, alliance, and transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I'm going to hand it over now to Dana.
Okay, I'm good. I'm unmuted. Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chris, so much for bringing us together, and Tate also for doing the work of bringing us together. I want to say thank you. I'm also thrilled to be here with you other grief femmes, right, from whom I've learned so much, both in years past and also, right, so much already today. I'm really excited for our conversation. I also want to acknowledge the land from which I'm zooming is Lenape land. And I do so in the hope that this might also provoke us in the context of today's discussion to reflect on how the disproportionate impact of COVID on Indigenous communities in the US forms part of the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. So I'm going to use my time today to offer, whoops, I already lost where I was. Okay, I'm going to use my time today to offer 4 basic observations about the necessity of de-exceptionalizing grief that might help contribute to our discussion. So Chris had noted in the call, the sort of event announcement that was circulated, right? That thinking about, or what Judith Butler would have called tarrying with grief, might help us avoid this too hasty push to get back to normal, to return to a normalcy that we wouldn't desire. Right? Indeed, we might ask in this context, as Jenna's just asked, whether the pandemic, in light of the higher death tolls in Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Pacific Islander communities in particular, should rather be understood as a grim expression of the normal, an intensified but still recognizable rendition of what Lauren Berlant would term the crisis ordinary. In this sense, and this is my first observation, tarrying with grief is a way of resisting the historical closures of a monumentalized understanding of the time and space of COVID, insofar as monumentality seeks to consolidate an account of the event as it rises above the ordinary flow of time, and consequently to foreclose on the questions, the possibilities that might emerge when it's considered otherwise. So we can see this kind of resistance to foreclosure in one of the projects I want to look at, an otherwise relatively conventional memorial project installed in Washington, D.C. last fall, which was meant to commemorate US residents who had died from COVID. And hold on, I'm going to start the screen share. Is it sharing? No. Yes, okay, great. So yeah, designed by the artist Suzanne Brennan Furstenberg, the installation combines the statistical uniformity, emphasizing monuments like the Arlington National Cemetery, which lies nearby, with the textured intimacy common to projects like the AIDS Memorial Quilt, by requesting people to contribute personalized flags when possible. It's here. What marks the memorial project, though, is not these familiar forms, but the way it renders them interrogative, the question posed in its name: in America, how could this happen? As you can see, it's actually, as the death toll mounted, more and more flags were added, right? And the toll, which is on this billboard, was increased. At one point, they actually ran out of both space and flags and had to continue to expand. The question is voiced in faux naive mode, implicitly answered in the time and space of the installation. It ran in the weeks before the 2020 election on land controlled by the District of Columbia as a reminder of and rebuke to the America that certain people then living nearby had promised to make great again. In this sense, it frames its titular question as a condemnation of the failed promise of democracy that America has historically been, even as it keeps alive the affective aspiration of that promise in its very memorial form. So we might back up here, though, and ask what it is about grief in particular that permits such questions to be posed in the first place, right? The obvious necessity, the self-evident mournfulness of times like these, with nearly 3.5 million people have died worldwide, explains the presence but not the promise of grief, or belief that a tearing with it might open some other way of knowing our moment. It's useful in this context just to underscore precisely what grief is, a negative affective response to the unwanted spatio-temporal change. Grief is what happens when someone or something that you don't want to be separated from is moved away from you in space and or time. Hence, its affinity to politics when we understand politics, I think, necessarily as the ongoing negotiation of the conditions of space and time relevant to how and when life can be lived. This brings me to my second point. Insofar as grief is understood both as an obligation and as a resource, it is laden with potential contradiction. It's something we don't ask for. We are compelled to acknowledge grief, to respect it, to express it, or at least to attempt, if we can, to bear it. At the same time, we continually position it as a psychic, social, and/or political opportunity. Chance for improvement, something to be channeled into modes of testimony, reorientation, and/or recalibration. In this sense, I think as politically oriented praxis is pulled in two directions. We both want to respect it, to let it take its own space and time, and to put it to work. The echoes of the Protestant work ethic in this latter attitude toward grief reflect the 19th century roots of mourning culture as a respite from, and hence not an opposition, but a resistant accommodation to capitalism and its now visibly threadbare fantasies of progress. And indeed, the familiar expectation that mourning will provide some kind of opportunity for self-reflection and self-improvement or social improvement has historically coincided with a tendency to offer respect and to offer that space and time only to recognize your majoritarian objects of grief. Even as the liberal epistemology of grief takes shape around its assumed ubiquity and universality, we all mourn, it's what makes us human, minoritarian grief is conventionally unrecognized and unspaced, always already foreclosed, positioning its subjects at the edges of that definition of the human. In this light, and this is my third point, even as we explore the possibilities that emerge from minoritarian mournfulness, we need to remain wary of replicating the assumptions of that liberal epistemology of grief, most notably the temporal exceptionalism associated with mournfulness. Now, this means resisting the alignment of grief, whether in formal mourning or putatively resistant forms of melancholia, with what I've called sacred time or the time of exception. To deposit grief as exceptional in some way is to insist on its non-coincidence with, and hence seemingly to resist, dominant modes of time. But insofar as this is posited as something exceptional, outside or above everyday time, it ends up sliding back into the logic of the norm, just as defining the past 15 months as an exceptional or unusual even historical period limits what it may come to mean to us, how we may come to understand it. Now, we can see this happening in space as well as time in the memorial installation I just mentioned. So even as its Arlington proximate location and style open connections to Civil War, hence recollecting the racial politics that its otherwise general form eclipses, it also aligns COVID with an event that is both exceptional and prototypically national, taking it out of the global pandemic context. So the time of grief, I would say, needs to be understood not as a time apart from, but as a fold within everyday life. And that's something I think not even the otherwise useful idea of tarrying that Butler develops sufficiently reflects. This means, and this is my final point, that we also need to keep in mind the wide-ranging, profoundly mixed structures of feeling that characterize the texture of grief when considered as a facet of everyday life. To think about how grief exists in registers beyond that of monumentality, memorial, the melodramatic, and how to take hold of grief beyond the sadness, the somberness, and the rage-forward spaces we have conventionally assigned to it. Now, my co-panelist, Josh Chambers-Letson, has written quite movingly of the ebullience that can accompany modes of minoritarian mourning as we sustain one another in the space of grief. I was reminded of this kind of affective mixing on a recent trip to see an art show that shares its title with this panel, Grief and Grievance, Art and Mourning in America, which is currently up at the New Museum. I'm going to turn this sharing back on. There we go. Originally conceived by curator Okwe Nweze, who died in 2019, the show is billed as a timely and urgent exploration into the way Black artists have grappled with mourning and grief in contemporary America. In light of this framing, what's striking about the show, I think, well, there is a lot of stuff that's striking in the show. One of is the ways that it actually is sort of frozen in time in 2019, right? So it doesn't take account of the events of 2020, neither really COVID nor the George Floyd protests, and yet still continues to speak to them, which also, I think, speaks to the necessity of de-exceptionalizing this historical moment. In light of this frame, what's striking about the show is how grief in the more familiar somber or sadness forward modes alternately pushes forward. It's very much present in this space of the show, and then recedes. In this collection of work, forbidding a minoritarian mourning, compounded by what Saidiya Hartman calls the non-event of Black Death, gives way to a reminder of the multiplicity of affective modes that are kept in play when grief is understood as a fold within the ordinary. In particular, and I'm not sure that this is getting sufficient recognition in the overall critical response to the show thus far, this multiplicity manifests in the work of the Black women artists, reflecting the way mourning is entwined within the femme obligation, specifically that of Black women and femmes, to care work, the ongoing attention what makes life go forward, and the consequent fine-grained understanding of the impossibility and inadvisability of separating grief from other forms and modes of living with, and living on. I'm thinking, for instance, of these pieces that are showing by Diamond Singley, an artist who uses ready-mades to meditate on the affective spaces of Black girlhood. The pieces are titled Entryways, and they're framed as a commemoration of Singley's grandmother, who kept a baseball bat by the front door of her apartment in case she needed to defend against an intruder.
Wow.
In this sense, the pieces are at once a recognition of the violence historically arranged against Black life in America, but they're also a celebration of her grandmother's work in making a space for Black livingness and living on. The very doors that need to be defended against intrusion also open outward onto other connections and possibilities. So the pieces remind us in this sense that the kind of psychic and cultural work we want grief to perform is less about holding on to the past per se, than about holding open the alternatives, present, future, and otherwise, that might emerge from an enlivened rather than exceptionalized relationship to that past. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dana. And finally, David, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Tate. And I'm just thrilled to be part of this conversation. I've often been asked in the past several months to make analogies between what we're experiencing now with the COVID pandemic and what happened and is still kind of ongoing with the AIDS pandemic. And I always refuse because I think the idea of analogy isn't always helpful or productive. That said, I have been thinking about it. And when Chris brought this up, I thought, well, the only thing I could actually talk about is my kind of negation, my kind of desire not to talk about it, my wanting to kind of differentiate between the two. But the more I thought about it, the thought that really came to mind that was really important to me that I really want to emphasize today, and if Chris, if you guys put up that first slide, I actually made a little slide for today's talk, which helps motivate me to think, that I thought the thing that's most impactful for me, that's great. And then we'll go to the second one. And we could just hold that there. Actually, we could just go back to me and then we'll come back to that. Is the role of the artist in both moments, right? And I spent most of my professional, intellectual, and political life thinking and writing about AIDS, and the way that I do it is through addressing the artistic response, both in the literary, visual, and performing arts. And what was going on in the early 1980s is what's going on again now, and that artists were called to respond in several ways. But the primary mode of address in the early 1980s, and I'm mainly talking about the US here, was artists were creating work to both raise awareness, raise money, and to memorialize the dead. And I think that we could see, and I'll talk a little about this in a moment, some analogies happening there. I think artists during the COVID year have also shared many of these impulses. And despite the terrible impact COVID has had on the performing arts, music, theater, dance, mainly the loss of livelihood, given the shutdown of theater and performing arts venues, artists have not only taken care of their own through Zoom benefits, performances and concerts, they have also been creating work directly in response to the global epidemic. And this is again true of what was happening in the 1980s. Artists were called to immediately raise money, raise consciousness, save venues, and at the same time use their own insights into creating work to immediately confront the moment that we were living in. Um, Beginning as early as the spring of 2020, the theater community began to produce various artistic responses to COVID, and nearly all exclusively online. And that remains primarily true, although things are beginning to open up now with the vaccine. In theaters throughout the country, artists raise money for other artists and help preserve the viability of theater itself by raising money for other artists and for theaters that were vulnerable to either eviction from the buildings that they were renting, bankruptcy at large, or just simply foreclosure, right? And if that wasn't enough, artists, especially artists of color, were at the forefront of demands to reimagine theater post-COVID as an industry committed to the practice of diversity and inclusion in campaigns such as hashtag We See You WAT, which stands in for We See You White American Theater, mobilizing grassroots campaigns designed to call out the effects of systemic racism in all aspects of theater making. The interrelatedness of the pandemic and race, the impact on Black and Brown communities, Indigenous and Asian people, and the social and structural inequities of access to healthcare, social services, housing, and more recently, the vaccine, these are the issues the artists are addressing. Given the time constraint, I want to focus on one work. And I know by focusing on one work and one artist, it kind of promotes this logic of exceptionalism as if this is the work that's most important. But I'm using this as both, I do want to call out a particular artist, in this case, V, the former artist known as Eve Ensler, and the work that they've been doing, and also use V's current work as a kind of representative of the kinds of work we're seeing across the country. V produced a documentary play called That Kindness, and her efforts were to call attention to the plight of nurses, especially though not exclusively during the early months of the pandemic when they were caring for COVID patients without basic and fundamental personal protection and equipment. The play was produced in partnership with the National Nurses United and the California Nurses Association. So Chris, again, if we could just put that slide up.
1 second.
And it's the second slide. And for those of you who might not remember V or not know who Eve Ensler is, V was most famous for the Vagina Monologues, the global campaign to end violence against women. Interviewed various, and for the Vagina Monologues, but also now for That Kindness, Eve Ensler interviewed various nurses working the front lines throughout New York State. These interviews were then edited and curated and performed by a cast of familiar figures, and you can see the cast on the side, from the performing arts. The play was performed as a benefit for local nurse organizations and streamed by over 24 theaters throughout the United States in October of 2020. The timing was specific. V and her collaborators were determined to politicize the working conditions of nurses and help mobilize the vote to displace Trump and other state and local figures who underplayed, if not downright denied, the reality of COVID. I'm showcasing this play also because the early community-based AIDS performances of the 1980s, and this is true for film and video too of that era, documentary was one of the main primary modes of address. Documentary being an efficient means to communicate information, relatively inexpensive and therefore more accessible to create and to consume. These project follows the basic formula for talking head documentaries, except the subjects are performed by actors. And in this case, actors with enough name recognition to secure a wide viewing and therefore raise more awareness and raise more money for the nurses. I would like you to listen to this quick clip by the actor Billy Porter, who performs Tony, a former military nurse, now working during the COVID pandemic.
And I was a military nurse. I've been all over the world. I've never seen anything like this. Even when Ebola came, and thank God we dealt with it in the correct way. We took it serious from day one. So going through phases of March to April to May, losing patients, seeing the body bags, losing co-workers, that's part of my team in the hospital. 2 in the ICU, 1 passed away from the ICU. 1 is still recovering. He still ain't right. And not necessarily physically, it's mental now. Back right. The other one is back at work, but she's just scared. People are still not taking it serious. People think it's buried in the sand. You can believe everything else, but you can't believe something that has killed thousands of people. And then now people are starting to say, well, I'm not really believing the numbers, not that many people. How ignorant are you? You get to see people on Twitter or Facebook and all of that, and they get it, or some of their family members get it, and then all of a sudden they're like, I believed it was a hoax. I mean, I didn't believe it was real, but now I just don't know. I get real upset about that because I signed up for the military. I knew being in the military, I took a chance of having to kill somebody or be killed. That was a choice that I took. I signed up for it. But as a nurse, I did not sign up to not have the proper gear to take care of people who are sick. That I did not sign up for. I signed up to take care of people properly and do the things I need to do to make sure my patients and ourselves are safe. But we did not sign up for this.
So I have friends.
Thank you. V's That Kindness gives voice to the concerns of nurses on the front lines, highlighting the needs of essential workers and demonstrating the importance of the arts in the process. In this case, this play raised money and awareness for nurses' issues and rights and set out to galvanize voters under the slogan, "Vote Care, Not Cruelty." I caught the performance at the Brooklyn Academy of Music's website, which was raising money in support of the Brooklyn Hospital Center for COVID Fund. This past year, there's been a tremendous amount of interest and energy directed to what we call essential workers, people whose job and careers are necessary for the function of society and its survival, even amidst a pandemic. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, identifies essential workers as, quote, those who conduct a range of operations and services in industries that are essential to ensure the continuity of critical functions in the United States. In terms of the vaccine, the CDC then further identified essential non-healthcare workers as workers who are essential to maintain critical infrastructure and continue critical services and functions. We've celebrated our healthcare workers, and again, thinking back on the AIDS years, healthcare workers were actually the problem at times, refusing to provide services for PWAs, refusing to provide just basic healthcare and social service needs for people with AIDS. So there's a little bit of a difference, and I think that I would agree with Jinna, who was pointing out the celebration of the frontline worker, right? But we celebrated our healthcare workers, our frontline workers in food services, delivery services, and the long list of industries and occupations deemed essential during the pandemic. To end, I would add to this list artists. I do have one final image if there's time, but if not, I could also end here and we could use it later, Chris. It's your call.
No, it's fine. We can totally do it.
Okay. The final image that I want to show is, and again, this sort of resonates with what Dana was pointing out in terms of efforts to both memorialize and call attention to. And I think, what I'm drawn to with both V's play and Billy Porter's performance in particular, and now this installation, is that they embody to me this idea of both grief and grievance during a pandemic. So the final installation is from last week's Nurses Week 2021, honoring the more than 400 nurses lost on the front lines of the pandemic. And I don't want to say there's only 400 nurses who have died of COVID, but these are 400 nurses that the Nurses Union had claimed both contracted COVID while they were working and then died as a result of it because of work conditions. A year ago, when this was first conceived, they placed 88 pairs of shoes in front of the White House to honor the 88 nurses who had died. A few months later, in July, the number rose to 160, and while the nurses were lobbying the Senate to pass the HEROES Act, which included assistance for essential frontline workers, and was now up for the Senate. The Congress had already approved it. The Senate was set to approve it, and Mitch McConnell kept deferring it, right? And last week's count was up to 403. The nurses are currently protesting this, and this is ongoing. So the nurses are continually now protesting the conditions of their working conditions throughout the pandemic. And their most recent I guess, grievance would be that they are protesting the CDC's latest recommendation for vaccinated people to discard mask wearing. And according to the Nurses Union, the CDC guidelines are a danger to public health and will take a disproportionate toll on frontline workers and communities of color. So I just want to end with the importance of both the role of the art, not just the essential, that we should include the artist as an essential work. It is critical to the survival of the culture. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Those were such wonderful presentations. I want to just open up some space for the four of us, or four of you, to talk to each other. I might pose a sort of initial question. One of the things that I'm thinking about, David, especially after your talk right now, is I'm thinking about the ways in which Freud, for example, talks about the work of mourning, right? And so perhaps a need to rethink the very category of work in the first place. I think that one of the things that Josh had mentioned while we were emailing is like the sort of pull or the push to return to normalcy is part and parcel of the sort of capitalist machine, right? So what does it mean for us then to rethink the term work, and especially the work specifically of mourning? And I think about this too in relationship to, Jenna, your comments about the sort of disproportionate onus placed on communities of color, right? What it means for communities of color to take up that work. And so then the sort of like converse of this question is like, what about those people who refuse to do the work, refuse mourning, refuse to even acknowledge that anything is lost here? And I think about this in relationship to folks who think about COVID-19 as a hoax, for example. Are there ways in which the sort of frameworks of melancholia and mourning, for example, can still be helpful in thinking about what's going on with the very refusal to enter into the work of mourning? So I wonder if anyone wants to sort of take that up or go in any other direction too.
Well, Chris, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
I do have thoughts. I don't want to center my ideas because I really want to learn from you all. I do think that one of the things that I'm thinking about here is the relationship between I'm thinking about the sort of refusal of mourning as I wonder if like melancholia itself as one of the sort of refusals of mourning can still be a helpful way of understanding what might be going on with folks who refuse to even recognize that there was like mass loss that is going on at the moment, right? And so part of what I wonder here is, and maybe this gets a little bit to Dana, your point about the sort of de-exceptionalizing of grief, that melancholia is oftentimes, I mean, like there are ways in which melancholia has been turned to in the scholarship as something that can be beneficial. It is also something that like really gets in the way, it fucks things up, right? Of actually overcoming certain sort of structures of violence and inequity, right? So I wonder, right, if part of this has to do with the ambivalent evaluation of the very category of melancholia in the first place. I mean, the other way in which I think about this, and the ambivalence specifically, is like what we count as good and bad mourning. Like what is this kind of mourning that is imposed on a collective and say like citizens to be a part of a nation state, and then alternative forms of mourning that go against that, right? I think about this in relationship to Biden's campaign, right? And the way in which Biden sort of exemplifies the white mourning man, right? It normalizes the expectation of a certain form of mourning. But then other forms of mourning are either disallowed because of really practical things like the inability for us to collectively come together, or because the lives that are lost are not seen as life lost, right? And so part of me is trying to figure out how to like square that as well. That maybe just opens up more questions, but those are some of the thoughts that I'm having.
Those are really great thoughts. Right? I'm having trouble because everybody said so much fantastic stuff. One of the things I really want to come back to also is the understanding of the bystander, but just to talk to this question for a second about the people who refuse mourning. Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think one of the things that I find helpful, I've always found helpful, there's a piece by Lauren Berlant called Unfeeling Carrie, where she makes this sort of distinction between those people who we think just don't mourn enough, right? And sort of, which at that time was, the name of that was George W. Bush, right? So this is 2004, this is around, among other things, the Iraq War, right? And this sort of understanding that, people, the refusal to respect humanity, right? And Berlant makes the case that what Bush mourns is a kind of subject that has become ascendant in neoliberalism, which is the security subject, right? So for us, we sort of think that our humanity is proved by our desire to be connected to other people and our love for other people, and therefore our grief when other people leave us. But for the security subject, what makes all humans alike is our desire for security, right? Our desire to be safe, right? Which is a form of subjectivity, or a genre of the human that which we call that legitimates policing and hoarding, right? Like it's a perfect excuse for neoliberalism. So I wonder, in a sense that refusal of mourning is a departure from the form of mournfulness altogether, right? It's a sort of holding out, like I will not mourn for these because mourning is just not the thing I do, right? Mourning is not what is most relevant, right, in this situation.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful, Dana.
I mean, it continues to puzzle, but the sort of the understanding of that kind of subjectivity as a form of hoarding, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
A form of hoarding that legitimates this sort of obsessive border policing in particular, and constant ejection of bodies from the space of safety, right? Is, I think, helpful to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I hesitate to say anything because I sort of wanted to punt over to Jenna because I like she's made such a really sort of carefully articulated, sorry, you can hear my aunt's dog barking on one side and my mom's dog on the other. Jenna has made such a carefully articulated case for the way in which melancholia can animate a kind of politics, a decolonial politics, a politics after colonial violence. But in thinking about that, one of the things that I've learned from that work is the work that melancholia can be put to, likewise the work that mourning can be put to. And it strikes me that, the work of melancholia, the work of mourning, the work of reparation, to name different sort of structures of feeling that respond to loss. I sometimes think there's a tendency in critical theory for us to want to like pick the one that's good and endorse it, right? So it's like, okay, Freud got it wrong because Freud wants us to move on, right? And what melancholia allows us to do is hold on to the ungrieved dead, right? This is the kind of like queer resuscitation of melancholia. But I actually think it's more useful to think using the language of work about the way that these things are put to work in the service of various purposes, right? I think about the sort of long practice of melancholic identification with atomic bomb survivors in Japan, which has allowed the Japanese state to continue to identify with the position of the eviscerated while distancing themselves, right, from the colonial violence of the Japanese state both before and after the war. Which in a weird way actually makes Japan a kind of quintessentially melancholic state, precisely because it can't actually even name or mourn the thing that it's grieving, which is its own colonial violence, right? Because it has to identify itself with the position of the victim within the war. So this isn't really leading to anything other than to say that I think, I am increasingly inclined to say mourning and melancholia and reparation, that all of these various frameworks are useful to us. And then the question becomes, how are they being put to work and whose agenda are they servicing? And when I see the sort of Biden calls for a kind of recognition of, or a collective mourning in relationship to COVID, on the one hand, I think I agree it is a relief to have that versus what we had previously, but it also scares the shit out of me, right? Because precisely at the moment that we see Biden sort of performing a kind of national act of mourning, which in the Freudian sense would be a kind of moving on moving beyond, I can see this intense imperative for us to get back to work at precisely the moment that death is just flourishing at the center of the site where vaccines are produced in India, right? Because the US is hoarding vaccines, right? And so in that sense, that mode of mourning, right? And then the flip side is I can also see a way in which a case for a kind of work of melancholia as we come out of this may also allow us to not see the profoundly asymmetrical distribution of death and violence that is materialized over the past 13 or 14 months in ways that are deeply racialized, that are deeply characterized by class, by nation, etc. So sorry, that's not like a fully articulated thought, but just maybe something to move with, and mostly a punt to Jenna.
Oh, thank you so much for the question. And, and I'm just really I'm drafting, off of everything that everyone has said. And, I think maybe a part of it, a part of my orientation in thinking about melancholia is, I work through Frantz Fanon, and particularly his work in Wretched of the Earth, where he is a psychiatrist for the French occupying forces in Algeria. And he comes to this conclusion that that healing is a colonizing act, that I am healing, that the work of healing, work of encouraging people to mourn and to move on is to allow them to continue to be occupiers in a comfortable way, and to also allow the colonized to accept their colonized position. And so this is a really significant shift for him, and it fundamentally changes his relationship to Jungian and Freudian psychoanalysis. And so I think Freud himself comes to a recognition that particularly in thinking about the violences of the two world wars, that melancholia is not a pathological non-mourning, but it is a state. It is a state, particularly that is rational, and so I think that, and I think of us as living in a state of war. We are in a state of war. We're not living in a state of peace, and so I think that that's a part of it. And then, in terms of the work, so this seems so trivial, but I've just been really taken by, I've been reading all of these articles that are encouraging people to mourn, like, oh my God, recognize that like you're mourning right now, like you're going through a lot of pain. These things are really painful. You couldn't go to graduation. It's really painful. And I don't mean to trivialize that, but when I read that, I think, my God, where do you live? Who are you? Like, how are you not grieving? Like, how are we occupying the world differently? That you need to be encouraged to recognize that what you're feeling, this feeling that you are living through, is grieving. And so that's a part of what I mean when I think about this work that is disproportionately born, and for, I think, all of us in this panel, that we walk through life and are grieving, mourning, empathizing, building bridges, doing the work that it does to grieve this, and recognition that grieving is a part of transformation. And so, that's a very sort of quotidian, this kind of narcissistic, concern that I have about this zeitgeist toward grieving, that that it's not necessarily moving us towards anything transformative. We're just at this place where we're just occupying a very different fundamental relationship to what grieving is. And some of us don't even know that we're doing that.
Thanks, Jenna. Thanks, everyone. So I want to encourage other folks to place questions in the Q&A that I can bring in. I think actually this is a great moment to bring in a question that we get from Ricky Varghese, who is asking a question that I'll paraphrase for everyone. So Ricky, obviously, thanks all of you for your talks, and he's asking a question for anyone who wants to speak to us. He's wondering if you might be able to distinguish grief from, say, mourning, right? I think there's a kind of like terminological conceptual question at stake here. What are the divergent contours of these affective and psychical experiences or registers? Are they different or similar? And Ricky lets us know that he's speaking from the side of, as a psychoanalyst who's thinking with Freud, Zizek, and Comey. And so is just curious if anyone would be able to sort of situate grief within the mourning melancholia dialectic, if there maybe is even a resistance to the sort of like articulation of this sort of strict distinction between those terms. So if anyone has any thoughts in terms of terminology here, that I think it'd be helpful as well.
Well, that falls entirely outside my expertise, so I can't participate in that question. So I'll pass, but I'll learn.
I mean, I'll spin with it for just a second, just because I've been teaching and reading that essay a lot recently. And I could be totally wrong, so come for me if I'm wrong. But my sort of vague memory of that Freud sort of just indicates, right, that mourning and melancholia both have a relationship to grief, right? And so far as like that they both fall under the umbrella of grief, but that they're different psychic structures for responding to grief. And I think we often emphasize Freud's note in Melancholia that the mourner lets go of the lost object and replaces it with something else, whereas the melancholic holds onto it and identifies with it, right, and internalizes it to such a degree. And we kind of emphasize that. The thing that we emphasize least, which is the thing I have been caught up on a lot, which is that Freud doesn't really have a problem with the identification of the lost object. He's like, well, that's weird and quirky, but people make weird, quirky identifications all the time. The real reason that Freud is sort of anxious around melancholia is that in making the identification with the lost object, the subject also starts to blame themselves or feel all sorts of negative feelings towards the self for the lost object, which is the self, and that this is so confusing that it leads to states of self-negation, which slides into suicidal ideation, right? And Freud's just really clear about that. He's like, the melancholic goes into a state of self-flagellation and sort of suicidal thought, that is his primary concern. And he's writing specifically there about patience. So he's actually sort of trying to work through a practical problem, which is what happens when grief goes off the rails and the person who is grieving starts to attack themselves for the loss. And I do think that and one of the reasons I've been sticking with that is just that in a lot of the moves to depathologize melancholia, whether in Munoz's work, whether in David Ng and Shin-Hee Han's work, whether in Anne Chang's work, that detail is often not picked up for understandable reasons. But folks, they don't really say one thing or the other about what you do with all of those negative feelings that come back on the self. But that to me has been really it's been a powerful thought for the last couple of months, because I do think it raises the question of like what happens in grief, without necessarily answering the question, for which I apologize. But if we're trying to sort of parse through what the different approaches to grief are that may manifest in mourning or melancholia, like what do we do with the effects of the negative affects or the ugly feelings that we then have to deal with, right? That's not just the feeling of loss or the feeling of grief, but like that feeling that depressive state that one may enter into in a state of grief, where you may actually get life in thinking and loving and idealizing the lost object, but you are also hating yourself and like literally doing things to hurt yourself and harm yourself, maybe even hastening your own death, right? In your pursuit of that lost object or whatever. And that those feelings can be really active, they can be political, we can put them to political use to ameliorate the loss. But since in melancholia you don't quite know what the loss is, it like the circuit of introjection and identification confuses you about what the loss is. It also means that those feelings of self-hatred, self-negation might start flowing out in other directions in really intense ways. And I feel like that's something that I don't want to be too prescriptive or psychoanalytic about the forms of racial violence that we're experiencing right now in this moment, but the sort of real uptick in anti-Asian violence kind of coming coterminously with the vaccine and the shifting landscape about how the pandemic was going, seemed to me to have something to do with a mourning population that couldn't really deal with its mourning and needed to find a place to dump its hatred on, right? And so where Asian Americans and Asian immigrants and Asians broadly in the US had sort of been blamed in early flashes of violence in the early days of the pandemic, it makes a lot of sense to me that it would become really intensely acute as the pandemic seems to be transitioning into another stage, because all of these ugly feelings have to go somewhere, right? And so without answering the question, I do think that that is something that in thinking through the relationship between melancholia, mourning, and grief, that specific structure that Freud identifies around the negative feelings that emerge and surface, and what to do with those feelings becomes really important, because one of the things that people will do with those feelings is then project them out onto other subjects so they don't have to feel them themselves, right? Easier to hate, and this is where sort of Asian Americans as the perpetual other, as the perpetually foreign non-subject, become really easy dumping grounds for a lot of feelings that, like, Americans who haven't grieved, white Americans who haven't grieved their own losses, right, need to put that feeling somewhere, and that is concerning.
That's great, Josh. I really quickly too, and maybe this can further the conversation. Your comments make me think quite a bit about another aspect of, and we don't have to we don't have to like tarry just with Freud, but like because we're here for a little bit, it makes me think of another aspect of the essay that's oftentimes not commented upon, which is the significance of mania that we get at the end of the essay. And it sounds as though a little bit like the ways in which you're talking about the sort of externally oriented violence might itself be like a manifestation, right, of this mania. And there's a certain way in which Freud indicates that it's not as if like the melancholia is ever going to be solved, right, or resolved, but that it could transform to just like its counterpart, which is mania, right? And so then I wonder, for example, if part of what you're suggesting is something like the kind of white supremacist violence that we get launched at communities of color may itself be an indication of an underlying white melancholia for the white subject that manifests through the sort of like through this like kind of manic proliferation of violence. So that's maybe something that I was thinking about, because I'm trying to think here about the ways in which we have such robust theorizations of racial melancholia in Chang, Ang, Han, but what about white melancholia? What is the place for that? How do we think about that in relationship to Freud if we want to do that? You know, so yeah.
Yeah, and like just as a tiny note on the end of that, I think this is where Chang is also really helpful, because Chang is really good at naming melancholia as a white structure of feeling that has a lot of violent effects for people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to add that, I think that Ang and Shin Han are really helpful here in, really urging us not to really privilege one form or another. It's not about, saying that mourning or melancholia, one form is better or not. But in thinking about melancholia as a kind of a form of reading, a kind of an animating the past and a kind of archive of violence, an archive of violence that we might ignore otherwise, right? And so for David, for Ang, it's about melancholic, marks the excesses of the liberal nation state. It marks all that is outside. And, this discussion makes me think about how, Frantz Fanon is really concerned that the suicide bomber, the Algerian suicide bomber, is diagnosed as melancholic, that they are, it's a pathologization, that their act is seen as melancholic, and thus is meant to be to be seen as illegitimate, and I think, again, this is a kind of, his refusal to, as we're talking about, to see this kind of difference between mourning as good and melancholia as bad, but really tying it to a kind of a state of colonized being, like when you are a subject living in ongoing war, these are rational, states to occupy, and we may go in and out of them at various points.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have another question in the Q&A. So Lorenzo is asking, so he wonders if anyone could speak to the kind of ontological operations that are made possible in grief. Can we think of grieving as an ontologically creative practice that redraws the boundaries, for example, of what is lost and what can be infused into the present as a claim? So how do secular states police the boundary between those dead and those gone? And he says that he's thinking here of a kind of policing of the senses, of what counts as a presence and what is cast as a pathological projection of the individual. So I'm curious if folks have any responses to Lorenzo's question.
I can say something, and I don't know if this is right, but this, goes to what Joshua was saying about Christina Sharp's work, and her invocation of wake work, and this, she uses so beautifully the idea of the wake, the sort of coming back and forth as a kind of a metaphor for helping us think about how why it's important to not draw this line between the living and the dead, in particular when you're thinking about the transatlantic slave trade, right? And like the denial of that history, because so much of the evidence, the violence is thrown over into the ocean, right? And so she is, really asking us to think about this like kind of wake work as a just a refusal to draw these boundaries, between living and dead, between what we might what we might normally consider as archive and not, and of course, the turn to haunting, Avery Gordon's important work around haunting, as again, really kind of going between all of those different kinds of, I remember when she came to give a talk at UC San Diego, and folks were like, what are you doing? You're talking about ghosts, when you should be talking about state violence. And she's like, that's exactly the point, and so I think that this work of haunting wake work, it just precisely disrupts these boundaries, but it asks us to take seriously the idea that the dead is not gone, and I think that's a part of what I think about with, this great question.
Yeah, David, please.
I just was hoping to ask Dana a question or engage Dana in something that she brought up, because I was drawn to how the arts were so featured in your presentation, and I was interested why that was the case, that you went there, and curious to hear more about not just the public memorial that you were talking about, which I actually didn't know about, and also then the connection with the Whitney Museum. So I was curious, and I don't mean to be too intense, but what is the role of either public arts or visual arts at large? I'm just curious what you have to say about that. And it's a friendly question, so.
No, thank you. I think part of it I would kick back to the comments that Josh was making toward the end of his thinking about sort of the role of the aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
The way in which grief gets negotiated, but also, and I think here, I'd want to think more about Gina's really like helpful thinking through the role of the bystander, right?
Yes.
So I mean, I think part of the reason that there's a sort of unsurprising turn to various art forms, both familiar and less familiar, right? And I think the first project is a really, really familiar form. Like we can sort of refer it back to a number of other memorial projects, and I think it was done in a way to sort of make something happen fairly quickly, right? In difficult circumstances and legibly, right? And something that also people could be, and we're sort of getting used to also these participatory forms of projects where, people.
And was that a site-specific event, or was that something that was encouraged to happen all over?
It's been retained online, right? So I don't know if it was, but it's been retained online. So in part because, as happens in events like this, like, somebody gets it going and it does. And I think necessarily and usefully in the way that grief sort of overruns any attempt to control it, right? Like the people's responses to memorial art often sort of outstrips any, the sort of whatever intention an artist may or may not have had, right?
Sure.
So there's this sort of push, right? Both the sort of the push of the circumstances where they run out of flags, they run out of space, right? Because people just are dying at this intensely accelerated rate, right? And end up sort of stopping because they, had to stop. They had it just for had not meant it to go on, right? But have also preserved it, right? And people bring their own needs and their own desires in that kind of interaction, right? So I think, I guess part of it is that, right, turning to the arts, part of it is that, I'm talking today, and so I sort of wanted to bring things that were visually illustratable, right? And that, in so far as there are short timeframes, I'm particularly interested in the kinds of narratives, right, that get drawn out with relation to grief, the kinds of histories that get drawn out, right, as we've been talking about. But we don't have a ton of time for narration across 7 minutes, right? So these were sort of like shorthanded impressions of grief's temporalities. But I also think that there is something, the thing about grief is it just keeps, and this may refer back in a sense to the previous question, is that it does sort of, it's not a chosen thing, it's not willed, and it can't finally be organized or worked through, right? Even when to come back to the mourning melancholia distinction, one of the things that has always intrigued me about that mourning melancholia essay is that Freud also doesn't know how mourning works, right? Like he just doesn't know why, he's just like, well, we assume that there's a sort of relative grief, but we don't know what happens in mourning, why people are ultimately able to bear their grief in mourning. Like we just know that they do. Right? It takes time also, he says, it takes time, and it takes a lot of sort of turning inward and sifting through, right? And so I think that that's part of what one of the reasons that the arts are touchstones, right, is the way in which we need a sort of broader sort of sensorium, right? Broader sensorium than we conventionally have, and particularly that we conventionally have in ways that we can articulate as policy, right? As sort of official praxis, right? That we need to be able to touch one another, to sort of smell one another, right? That sort of feeling, and this is something I think Chris was referring to with the difficulty of distanced mourning, right? The desire of being in the presence of, right? As a form of experiencing grief, and that's something that the arts often stand in for. So that's one of the reasons that I was thinking about that.
Thank you.
I wonder, so we're at time, but if I just wanted to pose 2 more questions. We don't have to, we can answer them as much as you would like, and folks can feel free to leave when they need to. But as we're running out of time, the question of time, I think, is the place that I sort of want to go here. I think Dana, especially, and Josh, you guys are bringing up the sort of specificity of the sort of concept of time and its helpfulness in thinking through the temporality of grief. Maybe, I guess the thing that I'm wondering here is there's also citations, right, of the queer temporality, right? And so part of what I wonder is if we, in a certain way, think of the sort of temporality of maybe melancholia specifically, but maybe grief more broadly, as itself like internally queer in terms of its time as well. Like, what is the connection here between queer temporality on the one hand, and then temporalities of mourning, melancholia, and grief, I guess, is sort of broad question that I have here at the end.
This is the tackiest way to answer that question, but I think one of my favorite moments in the Freud essay is when he just kind of says, as a passing aside, and like, of course, we know that the melancholic has a penchant for anal eroticism. Which, like, but doesn't really explain why. Like, why is it that melancholic people want to put things up their butts? It's not articulate. It's just sort of like, it's just a thing. But I also think that there's a reason that queer theory kind of ran with the structure of melancholia, because it does, like, the loss object that you can't quite name, that you have somehow identified with, but it's wrong to identify with. I mean, these are all sort of like queer circuits of both sort of loss and desire. Mm-hmm. And I would say that very quickly, just like queer, Black, Japanese, Latinx, in this context, our relationships to temporality are always right off of the dominant and linear time frame. Like, it's always off, right? The idea that loss will come after some kind of great interruption is just not something that diasporic people can imagine, because loss always precedes one's entry into subjectivity, right? And so if that's the case, then navigating and surviving and living within the world requires having a very nimble relationship to a temporality that is folding, that is recursive, that is repetitive, that is deeply, deeply queer. And I think queer studies is interrogation of temporality. Dana's work on this has been like really like the way in which we have rethought time, not as that which is linear and normative. I would say maybe it's less that the structure of melancholia is itself queer, and more that just queers might know a thing or two about living out of step with time, right? And I think we could say something similarly about racialized folks. Like, we know what it's like not to live in sync with time. And so the weird atemporality of melancholia, the weird atemporality of grief, which is time traveling in all directions at once sometimes, is something that folks of color and that queers might know a thing or two about, which would allow us to explore or inhabit those things in useful and productive ways, but also dangerous and negative ways.
Yeah, and I think thinking here with both Dana and David, knowing your work as well, do we think that, I mean, I wonder, what I'm hearing in your comment, Josh, is something like the significance of ritual time in particular as well, right? Repetition, iteration. And so I wonder if there's something about the significance of ritual time in relationship to grief that renders it, you know, outside of normative frameworks of time. So I wonder if David or Dana, you guys want to speak to that at all?
Dana, do you want to go ahead?
Mostly just to agree, right? I think, you know, that except that I would say, you know, with the caveat that, again, that I don't, that the sort of exceptionalizing of mourning is a relatively narrow cultural luxury, right? Like, very few people actually have the time, right? And we've seen this, right? We've seen this intensified again over the past year with COVID mourning, right? People who were denied the privilege of isolation, right? You know, working class folks, Black and Brown folks, Pacific Island folks, Indigenous folks, just denied the privilege of isolation, right? Being on the one hand greater exposed and suffering more, but also being forced to continue working, right? In part, in the conditions that expose them and cause them the losses in the first place, right? Like, there just isn't that sort of time for withdrawal and reflection, right? And isolation that so many of us have been keening over, right? So I mean, I guess, yeah. So I would just say, I mean, in terms of that kind of ritual, I think that it needs to be always thought of as a ritual of dailiness, right? A ritual of the everyday, right? And the way that grief soaks into some people's lives, it's not just simply a moment in people's lives. The way that grief really characterizes the texture of people's lives really needs to be understood, right? As within the time of the everyday, even if it is resisting sort of dominant, I would say not even so much even dominant modes of time, as just sort of dominant assessments of the meaning of time, right? Dominant assessments of history.
And I was really drawn to, I guess, for this past year, how certain artists who are deeply embedded in ritual and have been denied access to the rituals that sustain them, both not just creatively, but also in terms of how they understand themselves, then having to either mourn the loss of the ritual or cultivate new rituals. And it's particularly acute. And my sympathy is always for the artists. I mean, very acute for dancers, right? Who are denied spaces for rehearsal, and how then can they begin to move if they are living in isolation and in quarantine and in small quarters, or musicians who can't rehearse. And those artists who work in collectives as opposed to the isolation of the writer or the poet or the painter. And I've been very moved by the works that these folks have been doing, both online and in their own articulation of what they've lost in this past year. So this idea of like the ritualization of time, I think it's also too like that so many of these folks, including myself, like had to come up with entirely new systems of time and ritual and organization, has been just really an acute part of our day-to-day realities. So I don't know if it's necessarily simply anything more than that. So.
Yeah. And that's going to change again, right? We're shifting and we're going to have to come up with new rituals as we re-enter socialization.
Well, I think in the arts, the answer is no. I think the answer, this is where the grievance comes in, right? So it's not, we've been talking a lot about grief, and less about grievance in per se. And I think that one of the other things that's really motivating and inspiring is how, and it's not just people of color who are at the front lines of this, and there's white allies too, but like it's in the theater and the performing arts, there's a real call to totally transform these structures. And People who have been leading these institutions have been asked to step down, right? People who have been on the board of directors, all white directors, have been saying, no, this is not permissible. Whether it's in museums, galleries, theaters, even symphonies, right? So this need to hold people accountable, I think, is something that is going to alter. And I think that it was Gina that said that we will not return to like there's no like post-COVID, right? Like this is something that is going to, will be in for quite some time. But no, I think that this call out for accountability and this intense need to reimagine the structures of the arts, I think is very powerful and real.
Thanks, David. So I just want to ask, are there any final closing comments that anyone wants to make as we wrap up the conversation for today?
On a very simple call, I would just say support your local artists, right? So I only featured one artist, but there's all kinds of people doing really interesting creative work. And, you know, if you have the means, you know, buy someone's photograph, donate to a theater that's trying to come back. Why not, if you have an institution, invite an artist or a performer to come to your campus, right? We have obligations to these people who are vulnerable.
Thanks, David. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you guys so much. I learned so much from all of you. Thank you, Dana, Jenna, Josh, and David. It was so wonderful to hear from all of you. And thank you to audience as well. In any case, take care, everyone. Be well, and I hope to see folks in person soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Chris, for bringing us all together. Thank you for bringing us all together. I think it's really powerful that you imagine this. And are you ending your term this year?
Ending my term as what, David?
Aren't you the director?
No, I'm not the director. Not just yet. So, yes. But yes, thanks again, everyone. It's so good to see you all. Talk later.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.